Lift every voice and sing, tell earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty.
My name is Angel Mariah Thompson, and I have the honor and the pleasure of serving as your mistress of ceremony tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Miss Deanie Stevens.
All right, we can still make some noise because you know what? The Lord has given us His good breeze. Lift every voice and sing, tell earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let us march on till victory is won. All right, y'all, give it up.
It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce you to our distinguished president, Mr. Fred Prejean.
I welcome you to an educational event we hope you will appreciate. We've come together this evening to celebrate a joyful occasion, a historic occasion, a life-changing occasion, a spiritual occasion of miraculous magnitude. This occasion is of such significant historical value, we have a moral obligation to ensure it is never forgotten, never subjected to misconception, and never marginalized. Juneteenth is the occasion of which I speak and is also known as Freedom Day. It is one of these landmarks in historical events which exemplifies an example of an extreme course of history which literally changed the life of an entire race of people. While Juneteenth was a long-awaited resurrection of humanity, its arrival was only after a price of unimaginable pain and suffering. I suppose that is one reason the day it arrived brings forth freedom, and an end to slavery was so appreciated and celebrated. In America, we seldom talk about slavery. It is a blind spot in our schools' history lessons, as are the lynchings of African Americans and the inhumanity of segregation. The silence of these circumstances and events have left us vulnerable to new forms of bigotry and discrimination that we need to address as well. Acknowledging our nation's history of racial injustice is critical to addressing a range of contemporary issues. But instead, we foster the illusion that all is well and the history of slavery is best served by forgetting about it, not mentioning it. Let the past be the past, we are told. Those were the old times. The old times I think of are the kidnapping of African families, exporting them from their homeland, denying them their freedom, dismantling black family relationships, psychologically dehumanizing human beings, raping young black women for pleasure and producing a workforce, selling their children for profit, and working these innocent black captives to death while maiming or murdering those who sought freedom. 4 million black people were enslaved in the U.S. in the old times. This is what the old times remind me of. This justification, as stated by plantation owners, was that God made the black man for the purpose of serving the needs of the white man. Those were the old times the people of Texas felt relieved of and reason to celebrate the end of. Today, this day, that old-time mindset will not prevail. Juneteenth is celebrated on June 19th, 1865. Will be celebrated today as it was celebrated in 1865. We're going to sing, we're going to dance, we're going to shout for joy that slavery has ended, and we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that domination and discrimination ends right along with it. Until yesterday, I had hopes that the stain of slavery and discrimination that prominently displayed its existence in and prior to the early 1800s had dissipated into the sunset of an era gone by. But yesterday, last evening, at our parish council meeting, we saw a resurgence of vigilante-style hatred and intolerance practiced prior to the very Freedom Day we celebrate on this occasion. Last night we saw evidence of a rejection of the melting pot that this country was built upon. We saw a rejection of the right to self-determination, a principle this country fought an American Revolution over, only to sustain a state of bigotry that once led to a divisive civil war that threatened the principles of freedom and justice. We are compelled to speak out against hate-filled ideology. There is a definite healing power of truth-telling. We must have hope in the face of despair, because our lives begin to end the day we become silent, said Martin Luther King. As similarly described when stated by the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, he said, "America does not have a Negro problem. I say to you today, America does not have a racial, lesbian, or gay problem. The problem is whether the American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, and patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution and provide liberty and justice to all its citizens." That is the problem. That is questionable. Whatever happened to the motto, "E pluribus unum," out of many we are one? We have an obligation to continue in our just cause to make every day Juneteenth Day. And we would bring more than shame on ourselves if we didn't, and if we don't. We will not thrive in a world where our leadership of ideals are absent. Please join our organization, Move the Mindset, and participate in our efforts to confront racial inequality and other forms of discrimination and social intolerance which impedes our unity and ability to acquire and advance equal justice for all. We are about showing the world that we, as a city and as a people, able to acknowledge, understand, reconcile, and most importantly, choose a better future for ourselves and our families, making straight what has been crooked and making right what is wrong. And let us remember, a great city does not hide its true history. It corrects its flaws. Let us celebrate this joyous occasion and memorialize the many people who persevered and suffered while waiting for Juneteenth Day and that opportunity to say, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Welcome to our ceremony.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and it is my honor to introduce Professor Phoebe Hayes.
There's protection, I guess, in retirement. Because I feel as if I can do anything I want. I can basically say those things that I felt so long ago. Do you remember when David Duke ran for governor, and I think he then ran for senator? He wrote such a nasty letter to me about my people that appeared in our daily newspaper. And I was going to actually write a response. And my dear mother, who was a teacher in the school system, she said, you can't do that. And I was impassioned. I was angry because I felt as if he had just disrespected every black family, and especially black men, and their value. But she said, I want you to think about this. You're brand new to the university, well, almost brand new. And one day you need to get tenure. And one day you're going to go up for tenure, and you won't get it. Now, my mother was speaking from her experiences, born in 1933. I was born, I'll tell you my age, well, do the math. I was born in 1954. So I was a child of the Jim Crow era. But she warned me. She said, you may never get tenure because you never know what, you know, the backlash such a letter would cause. But you know, I'm retired now. So now I've seen other letters in our paper that have been very disrespectful and offensive and appalling to me. And I now have my voice. And I can say what I believe are my truths about fairness, about community, about my rights as a citizen despite the color of my skin. And even though this is 2019, I know that there are still some challenges that we as a race of people, and I'm talking about the African American community, we have to face. And it's not, those challenges are not going to get any easier if we don't protect our voices, if we allow racists to dominate the newspapers, to dominate the television screen, the news reports. If the only voices people hear are the voices of those people who are racist, or who hate people like me, or who feel that people who look like me have a certain place, and whose voices have a certain place in society. So I just want to thank the people I come from, because I understand the challenges that they faced back in the day, and I honor them. And I always like to use this as an opportunity to talk about to call my ancestors' name. I'm a child of West African slaves from Iberia Parish, and at the time it was St. Martin Parish, I should say. My people came here to work on plantations owned by the Broussard family, the Wallet de Queer family, the Arsenault family. And so I also have to call the names of the slave owners. And I've had people to challenge me and say, well, they didn't necessarily know any better. They didn't think that slavery was so bad. And my position is, when we know what's right and wrong, we know that the abolitionists of the day acknowledged or recognized that slavery was a sin. It was a horrible stain in our country. And at great peril, danger to themselves and their families, they fought to end slavery. One of my heroes during the 19th century was John Brown, because he didn't have to do what he did. And I know there was death and there were raids and what have you, but what do people do when they're fighting for freedom? There will be loss of life, etc. So I'm here today representing Jean Louis, my 4 times great-grandfather, Nancy Cato, my 4 times great-grandmother, Alphonse Manuel, my 2 times great-grandfather, Pierre Jenkins, my 3 times great-grandfather, Venus Jenkins, my 3 times great-grandmother. And I can go on, and I can tell you what plantations those fine individuals were enslaved on. Most of my grandfathers that I just named, I forgot Bernard Hippolyte. He was a cabin boy with the Union Navy, but most of these men served together in the Corps d'Afrique, or the United States Colored Infantry, and people called them contraband, and that always galls me. My people were warriors. When General, I think it is Banks, or was it Butler, one of them came through, the former slaves, they freed themselves and they went with him. And at Brashearville, which is Morgan City, they enlisted in the Union Army or the Navy, depending. So I'm very proud of the people I come from. They chose to stand up for their personhood. The women, I don't want to forget them. I have a great 4 times great-grandmother who received word that her husband, who had marched to Port Hudson with his regiment, was ill. Some kind of way, because the record doesn't explain, she made her way from New Iberia to Port Hudson, and she nursed him back to health. And the question, because this was part of the pension record and the deposition that she had to give, how did you return to New Iberia? And she said, I stayed with him until the war ended, and when they mustered out, I returned with his regiment. Now, I love my husband. I believe that I would take a bullet for him. From our area to, north of Baton Rouge, that's a lot of love, and they didn't have a car. But, so I honor my ancestors. I honor the ancestors who came from those West African nations, who were enslaved in those plantations here in Southwest Louisiana, which, by the way, people challenge. They'll say that, people in this area didn't have slaves. There was a young lady who came to my home, and she saw a lot of paperwork on my dining room table, and I needed someone to clean up, because, quite honest, I just don't have time. And she said, well, Miss Phoebe, what is this? And I told her it's about, it's my family history, and it's about slavery, etc. And she said, well, my boyfriend said that, Cajuns didn't own slaves because they were too poor. So I pulled out slave inventories of the people that owned my family, and I showed her my ancestors because I knew the names. So our boyfriend returned to the house the next day because he wanted to see them. And he wasn't ugly, it's just that he didn't know any better. Sometimes we're just handed information and we accept it as truth. So what does that have to do with, as if you don't know, what does that have to do with Emancipation Day, which I really prefer, because it's very clear what we're talking about, or Juneteenth? These were human beings, and they were just like us. I sometimes think the things I say to my husband or the conversations I have with my friends, my ancestors were having similar conversations. They were talking about things like, what are we going to cook for tonight, or what do you want for dinner? What they could not say when they were enslaved is, what do we want our children to become one day? Who do we want our daughter to marry? Because they didn't have that right. There was a gentleman at one of the events I went to he challenged me, but I don't think he did it out of an ugly manner. He said, but weren't there slave owners who were really kind to their slaves? And I took a breath, and I said, I'm sure. I visited a family in Oregon for a week who are descendants of Maximilian de Queer and Armand Broussard, etc. And they were wonderful, fine people. They shared with me plantation records of contained about some of my ancestors, pictures. One of them even has furniture from my 3 times great Aunt Kate. I so appreciated that. And she talked about how much her different family members loved Aunt Kate. And I don't doubt that. But here's the thing about this benign history, or this benign story about Africans who were enslaved. I just tried not to get emotional, which I tend not to do. I don't care how I feel. I just swallow it because I want people to hear me. And I don't want folks to get too defensive. I said, so let's assume that that's true. And I'm sure that there were people who truly loved their masters. And I'm sure that there were masters who truly loved their slaves, their servants. My daughter has a little Shih Tzu and she loves that little dog. So some of these people, they had pets. But when Armand Broussard died, or when Maximilien de Queer died, as they did, what happened to those individuals, those prized slaves that they had? They had no guarantee that they were going to continue to live that life of, I'm not going to say leisure, but that pampered life, because they were, valued servants to that family. Sometimes they were sold off. Sometimes their darling children were sold away from them. And I think about that and I would die. I'd probably be one of those women who were enslaved who killed herself if someone took my children from me. And I think a lot of people, they can get in touch with that emotion about how much you love your children. The idea of seeing my mother, my aunt, my twin, my sister being mistreated. How could I live through something like that? So I don't take lightly the experiences of our ancestors, because I know it wasn't easy. Even if they were pampered, they were not free. And their children were enslaved to perpetuity. There was no hope until, and I grew up thinking until the Emancipation Proclamation. Not true. The Emancipation Proclamation did not make slavery illegal. Slavery was still legal in this country when Lincoln signed it in 1863. There's even a circular that I found online that basically it pertained to St. Martin Parish, because New Iberia, because I tend to do a lot of research regarding New Iberia. Iberia Parish did not exist until 1868. But regarding New Iberia, Louisiana, there was a circular, and similar circulars went around the state that explained that there is an erroneous conclusion or assumption that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, when he signed it, freed all the slaves. That is erroneous. It's not correct. And then in the document, they went on to explain the conditions under which slavery continued in those areas. June 19th, which is the significance of this day, 1865, when General Granger went to Galveston and he read what's called General Order 3, number 3. He read this particular, where's Patricia? He read this particular, and I'm sure some of you have seen it, but I think it's worth us just hearing it out loud. The General Orders, number 3. The people of Texas, see, it started with Texas, but it applied across the country, are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves universally. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. So the free labor that they had, they enjoyed, that they built their wealth on, no longer existed. Now, that kind of heralded and ushered in Reconstruction, which I was taught as a child, Reconstruction was the worst thing that ever happened to the South. Well, it depends on how you frame it. But black men, black women who had been enslaved were now legally entitled to being paid wages. I didn't say fair wages, but they were entitled to being paid wages. No longer, well, sort of. Because there were people that usurped the system. They found ways to continue to get free labor from the Africans. But in general, legally, they were no longer entitled to the free labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly, oh yeah, there are conditions, at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, I kind of got a little bit indignant, because as far as, no, I don't believe in idleness and loitering either, but they were free men and women. If they wanted to hang on the corner, why couldn't they? The whites in the community could do it, but they used a lot of times some of this language as a way of continuing the enslavement of the blacks who had just recently been freed. So they locked them up. Little boys were locked up. They were picked up. But in general, I don't want to get so dark, this anniversary of Emancipation Day, Juneteenth, we celebrate or we commemorate as the official end of slavery in this country. And especially for us in Southwest Louisiana, it was the official end of slavery in this part of the country. Happy Juneteenth.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, and I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but y'all know what? But I'm not afraid to die, 'cause I already know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, and I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
Thank you so much. You know, this is a very sobering moment. You're in the right place at the right time, and I pray that the words have pierced your heart and you've listened with an open heart. Now I have the honor of introducing our second speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Reverend Dr. Larry J. Lloyd. Thank you very much.
Well, today we have the opportunity to join together with a number of people around the United States as we celebrate Juneteenth. This particular occasion, I believe, represents a moment in history that all of us need to really be thankful for. Some people prefer calling this day Freedom Day. Dr. Phoebe, you call it Emancipation Day. And most people would agree that this would be considered the second emancipation. And so as we gather together today, we are actually joining with other communities around the United States celebrating this event. I'm sure if you had the opportunity today, you were able to witness that the House of Representatives was holding hearings on the need for reparations. Many of you heard the comments of a number of people that were taking a position that reparations should still be in the conversation in the United States. A scholar and professor from Georgetown University, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, reminded the national audience today that students at Georgetown University are donating $27 per student to contribute to the descendants of slaves that built Georgetown University. Juneteenth should be about the legacy, at least in part. Juneteenth ought to be about the legacy of the 105 historically black universities and colleges, and especially for us in the state of Louisiana, all of those schools that was built by former slaves. Some people are aware of the fact that during the Obama administration, President Barack Obama tried to make Juneteenth a national holiday. It failed. In 1776, the founding of this country, every state in the Union was a slave-holding state.
That's right.
What I want to share tonight is what most people don't know about Juneteenth. And as a reminder, I think it's important to know that there is a historian and social activist of Puerto Rican and African and German descent, Arturo Alfonso Schober, said this, and I quote, "American history is simply the missing pages of world history. African history is simply the missing pages of world history." Whenever we talk about Juneteenth, this is an opportunity for us to find those missing pages in American history and let the truth be told. And so Arturo Alfonso, in my opinion, was right when he said that African history is simply the missing pages of world history. As we celebrate Juneteenth, today, you and I stand in the shadows of Harriet Tubman, who said, "I freed 1,000 slaves, and I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew that they were slaves." An interesting point that I think we should note, what most people are not aware of about Juneteenth is that it is a myth to think that the slaves in Texas were ignorant people. Let me make that clear. It is a myth to think that the slaves in Texas were ignorant people who received word that slavery was abolished. The truth is that this was a military campaign in which the Emancipation Proclamation had to be enforced by guns and bayonets. Texas was the last of 10 states that were in rebellion. What most people don't know is that between 1836 and 1845, Texas was an independent country, and it took pressure, abolitionist pressure, that caused Texas to drop slavery in 1865, even though slavery had been abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation. So what most people are not aware of is that those slaves in Texas were not ignorant. They were waiting. They were waiting because this took resistance. It actually took bloodshed. It took a lot of force in order to make this happen. It happened finally. In October of 1862, Frederick Douglass said, and I quote, "In order for the Emancipation Proclamation to free any slaves, we must have the ability to put down the rebellion." Texas was in rebellion. Most people are not aware of the fact that those slaves were like others, wanting to have a decent life. After Juneteenth, they were encouraged to stay in Texas. Many of them were encouraged to stay with the people that were their masters. A movement began as a result of that. It's called the scatter. They began to scatter from Texas during the time that we know as Jim Crow. A lot of locations, including Southwest Louisiana, was known for atrocities. Some of our ancestors, leaving Texas, left trying to find a life of freedom, trying to find what would become their future. Many of them risked their lives trying to swim across the Sabine River. As a boy, I remember driving with my dad to Texas, and every time we would cross the Sabine River, it was a constant reminder that that was the border between the state of Louisiana and Texas. What most people are not aware of is that many of our ancestors were shot, many of them were killed, many of them drowned in the Sabine River trying to find their freedom. It is unbelievable. Some people in our state are not aware of the fact that during the Jim Crow movement, there were towns, communities, known as sundown towns. If you haven't heard of it, do a brief search on cities in the United States that are known as sundown towns. It is amazing every semester when I talk to my students about some of the things, the atrocities that took place in cities around Lafayette, Baton Rouge, North Louisiana, and towards the west coast of the state. There were sundown towns. What does that mean? I had one student to tell me, "Dr. Lloyd, my mother advised me that as I would drive to Southern University, make sure you don't stop for gas in certain cities after you cross the Sabine River." There are cities that are known as sundown towns. Those towns are known historically for not allowing people of African descent to be around or do business after sundown. Those sundown towns were restricted for people of color. And so students now, even today in 2019, students today are still having to be concerned about certain cities that they drive through because they are sundown towns. As I close, let me mention that not very far from here, there was a community that was also a sundown town. There's a gentleman right here in Lafayette who is responsible for writing a book. You could find it in the Lafayette Parish Library. Mr. J. Kennedy Green wrote a book on the history of Long Plantation School. Some of you know a little bit about that history. And Mr. Fred, I thought it would be appropriate that since we are about maybe 3 to 4 weeks, a little longer than that, maybe a month and a half away from the anniversary of one of our Lafayette police officers who lost his life, and the school, Long Plantation, was renamed after him. 1 year ago, August the 8th, 2018, Corporal Michael Middlebrook was given the honor after his death to have that school named after him. I mention that because I believe the truth is, as we celebrate Juneteenth, we have to understand that it's not only African history, but it's the history of the United States of America. And in some ways, we cross racial lines. This officer, Corporal Michael Middlebrook, lost his life in the line of action. I met him at least twice. And as a church, as a member of the clergy, we stood with his family, although I was in Africa at the time of his funeral. I'm mentioning Officer Middlebrook today because I believe that that community in the Youngsville area should be remembered. Youngsville at one time was a sundown town. Youngsville was a location where people of African descent were not allowed to do business after sunset. Tonight, I think that we have a lot to be thankful for. I believe that we've come a long way. I believe that it is important for us that we share with our children, our grandchildren, that the dream of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Dr. King, and one of my heroes, whenever we talk about South Africa, Nelson Mandela, all of those people knew something about the struggle for freedom. And I believe that as we stand at this historical site, it's important for us to remember that we have something to celebrate. The old hymn says, "We came a mighty long way." And we thank God today that in spite of all of what may have been atrocities and or things that may have happened historically, we are still a people who have overcome. Tonight, we stand in solidarity. Right now, in Atlanta, in Los Angeles, in Houston, Texas, in communities around the United States, we are standing as one because Juneteenth is Freedom Day. And if you don't remember where you came from, you won't know where you're going. I want to challenge us tonight to remember that this country is blessed. But the United States is blessed because it was built on the backs of people who were strong, who were brilliant, who were courageous, and who were loving people. Mr. Fred, thank you for the vision of Move the Mindset. And I want you to know that my congregation and I will stand with you in the future projects and vision of Move the Mindset. And I want you to know the best is yet to come. God bless you. Amen. Amen.
Next, we are going to hear from one of the board of directors of the League of Women Voters, Dr. Christy Green.
Thank you all. I am Christy Green. I'm on the League of Women Voters State Board of Directors, as well as a member of our very active Lafayette chapter here. I wear some other hats as well. I'm a proud member of Move the Mindset. I'm president of Indivisible Acadiana. But tonight, I want to just echo very briefly a few of Dr. Lloyd's fine words, tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the League of Women Voters to protect a right that I think is very important to anyone who is concerned about emancipation, the right to vote. So, as I said, Dr. Lloyd and I may have passed each other on the streets or in the skies recently. I too just came back from South Africa, where I did things like go to the Apartheid Museum, the site of the now Constitutional Court, which is located in a prison, an infamous prison that housed Nelson Mandela and before him Mahatma Gandhi, and is now being reappropriated as the site of the South Africa's highest court, reflecting the values of democracy and equality and everything else that's in their wonderful constitution. I also went to visit the Cradle of Humankind, UNESCO World Heritage Site, where some of the fossils of our most ancient human ancestors have been found, because we're actually all Africans. So we have a lot in common, Dr. Lloyd and I, and I'll have to get in touch with him on some of these matters later. But I wanted to let you know about one big national initiative that we've been doing at the League of Women Voters, and some of our regular business that has an enhanced importance this year. The national initiative is something that our Louisiana state chapter was one of just a few select state chapters around the nation that was invited to participate, and it was a special initiative around the For the People Act. This is known as H.R. 1. It was the very first act offered up by our current Congress, and it has three main components: voting rights and voter access, money in politics and ensuring transparency and reducing some of the power of that money in politics, and also just general anti-corruption measures, because I think we can see at our national level, our state level, even sometimes our city level, evidence of corruption. So these are three main areas for the League of Women Voters: voting rights, money in politics, and anti-corruption measures. So the particular effort that we were asked to do featured a full-page ad that some of you may have seen, and it ran in all three versions of the Advocate newspaper, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Lafayette. The national organization kicked in $12,000 for that big ad. had. But we also got a fund to have postcards. We have about 600 postcards making their way up to our senators, John Kennedy and Bill Cassidy, because the H.R. 1 for the People Act was passed in the House of Representatives, and it was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tom Udall, a Democrat from New Mexico. But our Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has said that he will not allow the legislation to be heard, much less voted upon. So the purpose of this initiative is to prevail upon our senators, to prevail upon their majority leader, to let this bill be heard and have an honest vote so we can see where our senators are on this. So in addition to the big advertisement, the postcards, there was a senatorial visit component. And I was on my way to Africa and had a day free in DC, so I thought, what better use to make of this than visiting my senators? So with a league chaperone, I went to visit our senators, Kennedy and Cassidy, and the amazing thing that their staff members told me, I didn't meet the senators, just their staff, but they said, oh, our senators are too young. They're just in their first term. They're not on the right committees. They really don't have the power to be effective here. And I'm thinking, they're senators. They're among the 100 most powerful people in the nation. If they don't have power, who does? So our purpose there was to empower, encourage, and maybe even emancipate our senators, to encourage them to ask their boss, the Senate Majority Leader, to allow the bill to be heard. We had a little editorial about that, which ran again in all three versions of the Advocate just this Monday. So we're making waves, and we were actually selected by the national organization with the idea that perhaps our senators being young and maybe wanting to be effective. Senator Kennedy recently lamented that the Senate were sitting around on their ice-cold posteriors. I won't use the exact word that he used, but we'd like to give them a little something to do by having this legislation put in front of them. But that's a sort of special issue, which a special initiative that we're very proud of. The main work of the League, the very first time I ever heard of the League of Women Voters was in connection with the League of Women Voters Voter Guide, which is put out every year. We are working on it right now. Hopefully many of you know that we're not only electing a governor and our entire Louisiana legislature, but we have some very important statewide positions, Attorney General, Secretary of State. I just met a candidate running for Commissioner of Agriculture and Forestry last night. So there is a lot going on, and the League is known for its careful, well-considered, nonpartisan information on who's running so that voters can make an informed decision. I'll say we've heard many dates today. We've spoken about today, Juneteenth, June 19th, 2019. We have heard about June 19th, 1865. We could also mention, for those of us concerned about voting, August 6th, 1965, when President Johnson signed the Voters' Rights Act. But there's another important date that we're celebrating this month. June 4th, 2019 is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. That's women's suffrage, people. And so we're excited about that at the League. The League is also celebrating its 100th anniversary next year. It is open not only to women, but to men. So if you're interested, we do have a very active Lafayette chapter, and I urge you to get involved. And I especially urge you to make sure, if you don't know whether you're registered to vote, if you need to register to vote, we have a voter registration table, League of Women Voters, right over there. They can get you information on how to vote. There's another very new and exciting development this year. Our state finally passed voting rights restoration measures for formerly incarcerated people. I think Kelly Garrett from Vote was here earlier. I'm not sure if Consuela Gaines is still here. This is very important. It hasn't been widely advertised. There are special procedures that people who have been incarcerated need to undertake to be able to restore their right to vote. But that precious right to vote, for which so many of us have fought, can be restored. So we want to make sure that everyone knows about that. So with that, I'll close my remarks and just say that I'm honored to be here, and happy Juneteenth.
While this is a joyous celebration that's dedicated to the freedom and justice for all, it is also a solemn occasion. In the American South, we don't talk much about slavery. We don't talk much about the lynchings, and we don't talk much about segregation. Yet, we've littered the landscape with the iconography of the Confederacy, which we've actually romanticized. Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said, and I quote, "Without the military help of the freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won." We must change the narrative about race and the embarrassingly tragic horrors of slavery in America. Our history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived nor forgotten. Yet, if faced with honesty, with dignity, and with courage, it need not ever be lived again. There is indeed a reckoning that's happening in America. How we remember our past, how we remember our history. And this location, this very location, was specifically chosen as an indictment to that old narrative. Yes, this is indeed a solemn and joyous occasion, a time to reflect on the tragedy of the past. And yet, it's also a time as well to look into the promise of a bright future. Once again, my name is Angel Mariah Thompson. It's been my pleasure to serve as your mistress of ceremony, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to Jeremy Benoit and Major Handy.
march on till victory